Hey, this is They Talk Funny, and I just cut you off as we started the music, as we were doing a little pre-spiel, and realizing that it was like a minute to go. I'm welcoming anyone that's watching this on past view. If you're watching it live, just go into the comments, say hi, tell us where you're viewing from so we can get back. I did a little bit of math today between the various live streams I've been doing, and I just figured out that I'm over 7.3K views, so 7,301, just so I can say over, because it's 301 views, and that have happened since the lockdown started. And considering that 2 of the stream shows I do didn't start until mid-May, a month, 2 months after lockdown started, I think I'm pretty happy with that. Welcome, Habib.
Hey,
how are you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Thank you, man. Thanks for having me. This is quite elaborate. You totally caught me off guard with the start of the show, and I wasn't expecting. I was expecting theme music. I wasn't expecting the animation. This is a professional enterprise, man.
I'm way too ratchet for most anything that I ever do. It's just like this is considering that this survives off a donation. So if you're watching this, or if you're watching this on YouTube, there's a donate button on the front of YouTube. I'll put a PayPal up later if anyone wants to donate to keeping the channel going. But it's a passion project. I get to talk to comedians who, most of them who I've known beforehand, and we talk about writing, life during COVID, and all that fun stuff as we get going. Habib, I met you in Montreal.
We met, man. We met. I was 3 years into comedy. I was 3 months into comedy, I would say, give or take. We met. I was like very, very fresh into comedy. I hope you don't take offense at this. I don't remember that moment that we met. I don't have like a, and then the butterflies and all that. I actually have no recollection, but the show that we ran, the 905 comedy show.
902.
Was it 902?
Yeah, 905 is Ontario.
905 is right.
902.
I've been in Toronto too long, man. It's just so the 902 comedy show. Ironically, I was in Halifax. The last set of shows I did before the lockdown was in Halifax. Was in Halifax out there. I got to get out there and headline. But the 902 comedy show, man, I remember you reaching out to me and 2 other comics. I don't know why you chose us, but you asked us to help you run that show. And that was I learned a lot, man. That was very instrumental in teaching me how to run a show. But also honestly, man, just having that extra stage time, because Montreal is a great place to do comedy at. Stage time is fairly limited. So it's a very precious commodity. And so to have it offered to you at that early a stage and be given to you with a lot of trust and very regularly, like I've always appreciated that, man.
I did what I could. I would recognize somebody who was hungry. And then try to get some free work out of them. That's basically
because I was skinny, man. You were like this dude missing a few. Yeah,
Well, it's also we had that little bit of food discount when so we could eat there because we were doing it at a restaurant.
Yeah.
So that happened. But yeah, I mean, all right, you're a doctor now. You were studying your Ph.D. at that time.
Yes, actually, so I was done. So basically, I graduated. I graduated from McGill in, I think, whatever it was, like 5 or 6, 7 years ago.
You've got a piece of paper with the date on
What's time at this point? I think it was 2013, really. It was 2013 because I'm just under 6 years in comedy. And it was a year before I started comedy. I spent a year looking for work, man, and a year out of a PhD program with a fairly, I mean, I had a good resume, I had good experience, I had the PhD, that should have been enough, to be honest. But a year in, I couldn't find steady work. I was running contract to contract, and just had to take. I was 35 too, so I had to take a little bit of a moment of self-reflection, and be like, I know what I'm chasing at this point. I'm trying to validate this degree, but is this really what I want to be doing? And so I took a while to kind of process what I really wanted to do. Took a while to figure out. I mean, we're talking a few weeks to a month, not. And then I was like, yeah, I've always wanted to at least try comedy. That was one of the things. I made a list of 3 things, right? I did 2 of them. They went well, but they were short projects. Comedy was the only one that was kind of open-ended. And I started comedy in November of 2014. And I got my first set the week I signed over my lease because I was leaving Montreal. So my first year of comedy, I ended up just kind of like, let's see where this goes. I decided to stay, but I had no apartment. All of my stuff was already in storage. So my first year in Montreal, I went really like couch to couch, Airbnb to Airbnb, sublease to sub. It was patchwork of everything. It was a patchwork of wherever I could stay for a period of 10 months. I think I ended up staying in like 22, 23 apartments but it was comedy. I liked it. That was the only thing really keeping me here. And I'm like, I've crapped out for so long. And this is the first time, that's the first positive thing that happens to me in such an extended period of time that I'd like to nurture it and see where it goes. And I was very fortunate to get a lot of support, and to grow a lot very quick in that first year, to the point where I was like, okay, this is something that I want to pursue.
Yeah. I noticed that we've got a few viewers here. So if you're watching on Twitch or on YouTube or on Facebook, just put say hello in the corner. If you got any questions for Habib, just put them in there and we can bring them on screen and have him answer them as well. Your background is pretty diverse as well, because you were born, you said, a stone's throw from Bethlehem on Christmas Day.
Yeah, I was born in Jordan.
Okay.
Yeah, I was born in Jordan, so not too far. I was born in Amman, Jordan. My father worked for Lebanese Foreign Affairs. So every 4 years we were, he was posted somewhere else. So I got to grow around in a fair amount of like a mix of North American and Middle Eastern countries. So that at a very young age, questioning identity. I was in the Middle East. The countries that I grew up in the Gulf, were also very diverse. So in my classroom, we had people from India, Pakistan, from Brazil, from Argentina, from England, from Germany, all in the same classroom. So I grew up in very whatever the opposite of uniform right now, very kind of very mixed and diverse environments. And I remember I had like a few experiences at a very young age that kind of shaped how I saw culture and identity and race. And I think that's later on in my reintegration in North America, is what I like to call it. That really informed how I navigated society, and that still continues to inform my comedy. Like I remember in grade 9, my desk mate, we were assigned like desk mates. It was fixed seating in class. But my grade 9, like a classmate was called, or desk mate was called Ajay Royan, which is a very Indian sounding name. But the dude who came up and sat next to me was like very light skinned with green eyes, but a thick Indian accent. And I'm like, how does that work, man? And he just explained to me, that was my own prejudice, but he just explained to me, he's like, yo, in the North, we're just light skinned. Clearly the result of colonialism and imperialism and a lot of, racial intermixture, to put it nicely. But that was like at a very early age, I kind of had to start questioning like the preconceived notions that we have around identity and culture. And that's something that permeated comedy. And
definitely. I do got to interrupt because we do have a guest who's chiming in. I don't know Goro 187, but they're bringing you the blessings of Lord Victor Von Doom. You've got a nerdy enough friend who would be doing that? Just you're still welcome in the humble lands of Latveria, though. Just to make sure you're aware. And Habib, but do not bring Reed Richards with you ever again. So I don't know if you want to mention anything else that you've taken on planes that you shouldn't, or cross borders with. He does not know the glory of Lord Doom. Reed is so short. I think that should be short-sighted. And
maybe he just got one short leg, man. Maybe he just like No.
I'm saying nerd to me is a compliment, Goro. You don't understand that this is the same channel that broadcasts the Battlecom, the Geek Wharf comedy game shows. So, Dr. Dune will not stand for such disdain. Well,
I
we'll
have
have to have Scott
no idea
Andrew
what any of this means, man. I
all
hope.
right. So you're out of your geek depth on this one.
Oh, 100%, man.
All right, I've got 5 Doom bots coming to my door. I hope they don't look like Montreal police officers. Just to be sure, because that would be the worst disguise they could possibly have. This is the wonders of doing it online. Thank you, Goro, for watching. Now,
do you know who Goro is?
No,
idea. This is
not with that name.
Right.
One of the beauties of like having it when people do it from Facebook, because Facebook knows everything about you. It tells me who they are. It also gives their pictures. Goro is saying he's in the country of Latveria, which belongs in the MCU. Actually, in Marvel Comics, it hasn't arrived into the MCU as of yet. This goes deep on the nerdity, and it's a positive nerdity. So Goro, don't go complaining and sending Doom bots our way. Now, Habib, you got into hold it just a second. We get Tim Riel is popping up. Hold up.
Oh, hey Tim.
Love in the Side of a Hill.
I don't know what love in the side of a hill, man. I've never felt as ignorant. Hey, what's up, man? How you doing? I keep expecting you to talk back too. I'm like, I can see you. Is he calling in? No, he's so yeah.
All right, he's saying live. Does Habib live in the side of a hill? No, he doesn't. He lives in the nice
Toronto.
In
Toronto construction, man. Every take what you can get.
Oh, for the angles, I get it.
I don't get it either. That thing is straight. I put a level on it. I promise you it's straight, but I totally understand what you're saying.
I've lived in Montreal long enough to know that nobody's straight. It's okay. So so you got like a worldview, a rather expanded view. You've actually headlined the Nubian Disciples of Prior, which is Kenny Robinson's show in Toronto, which is the closest to no, I don't want to denigrate it by saying a BET type comedy show in Canada. It's like there is like the Black Circuit, which is in the States, and in Canada that doesn't so much exist. But Kenny Robinson has a special night in Toronto that's the last Sunday of every month, and it usually focuses on comedians of color. So what was it like for you going on headlining that show?
That was insane, man. I mean, first of all, Kenny, that show I believe is the longest running comedy show in Canada currently. It's been going for 25 plus years on a monthly basis, and that is a show that Kenny started essentially to provide, I guess minority comedians or comedians who weren't. I don't want to get caught in like the terminology, whether it's black or minorities or but essentially it was to give stage time to to comics who were not comics of a certain background, culture, racial, ethnic, who were not getting enough love elsewhere. And honestly, man, like when I came to Toronto, that first year was insanely tough. Like that transition from Montreal to Toronto, I was still 2 years into comedy, so I didn't really know what I was doing comedically. I still don't, 3 years later, I still don't. But at the time, I was a lot greener, I was a lot fresher, and I just went and introduced myself to Kenny. Man, it was a very rough year in the city and a very rough first few months because I really didn't know anybody. And there's a certain type of stage in terms of like a true open mic that we don't really have in Montreal. I think in Montreal we're kind of fortunate enough that most of our shows are attended, poorly attended or not, but most of them are attended. There aren't very many rooms where you're going to wait 2.5 hours for 5 minutes to 12 comics who have their heads buried in notebooks. Right. And so for the first year and for the first 3 months, in Toronto, that was all the stage time I was getting. I couldn't get booked on shows because people didn't know who I was. And Kenny put me on. All I did was go introduce myself to Kenny, and he was like, "You come to a spot next month," and that's a show that's very hard to get on. So I was already kind of, appreciative and fortunate for that opportunity. And then I think Kenny put me on like 12 times in 15 months. And nobody's ever shown me that kind of love. Nobody's ever shown me that kind of support. Kenny will put his arm around me and be like, "Hey, this or that, or da, 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 da," without ever giving me advice, like kind of giving me his opinion without telling me how to go ahead and fix it. Because once I asked him, he was like, "Listen," and he said this actually after I headlined. He was like, "You got the chops, man." He's like, "You got the chops. You understand what you're supposed to do. You got the material. But right now, you're just a dude who's telling jokes into a mic." He's like, "If you want to be out there and be up there for 45 minutes, for an hour, you got to learn how to perform." Right? Yeah. He's like, "You got to bring it. You got to bring some kind of energy." And I was like, "How?" And he was like, "Go figure it out. That's not on me, kid," and he'll be like, "Hey, you go figure it out." But that was the show that I stopped wearing hats. I've not worn a hat. I know, you know me. You don't know me not wearing hats. That was the last time I wore a hat on stage.
How many times did I tell you stop wearing that?
Yeah, you did. And I thought about you, man, because I looked at myself. I watched that set. So I will preface this, man. The first time I did Nubian, like when people found out I was doing Nubian, I heard so many people, and I've never had this experience with a show. I heard so many people say, "Yo, congrats, super dope." I don't know if I'm allowed to curse, but they said, "Don't fuck it up."
Yeah.
Don't fuck it up. Don't fuck.
And I was like, we're 18 plus on
okay.
This. So, okay.
So I was like, "Yo, why is everybody saying this, man?" And I promise you, I've never felt as nauseous before a set. Like I thought I was gonna vomit. I've never had that kind of like anxiety. And I went up, and as soon as I got that first laugh, it almost comes in waves. I've never seen, and I'd never experienced anything like it, because it's 300 plus people packed, like probably in a space that just fits 300. I'm not trying to get anybody into any fire code violations. And this shit goes in waves, man. Like the front row left, it'll hit the back row, and then it'll come back to you. So sometimes I had to adjust to the metronome of the laughter in ways that were like very almost jarring, right? And so fast forward like about a year and change later, I had done a fringe run with John Paul, another comic that I met, a veteran of the comedy scene in here and in Canada, really, and who became like I would say he's one of my closest friends. Period. I was going to qualify it and say closest friends in comedy, but he's become a good friend, like just in life. And we did a fringe show together. The challenge in Toronto was to get enough stage time to kind of grow in the ways that I wanted to, because festivals are dope, man. I've never done one, and I'd love to do like a big name festival for the credits and the experience. But ultimately what I want to do is extended time on stage. And 3.5 years or 3 years into comedy, nobody had given me a half an hour. Nobody had given me 40 minutes, and nobody should have, to be honest. Like, let's be real.
That's why the eyebrows went up.
Yeah, but I could do that for myself. I could produce. So I ended up doing a fringe show with John Paul. It was an 80-minute show, and we did 40. It was 40 minutes each, and it was just straight stand up. And that gave me the confidence that I could do 40. First of all, I went in trying to see if I could just be on stage for 40 minutes.
Yeah. Right.
I didn't even assume that I could hold a proper 40-minute set. And it became apparent to me that I could hold a 40-minute set. And I know that's not common that's not common for 3.5 years into comedy or 3 years into comedy. But I reached out to Kenny, and I was like, "Yeah, I think I'm ready to headline, man. I'd love the opportunity whenever you can have me on." And he said, I've been waiting on you to ask. And 2 months later, he put me on, and it's 35 minutes. I've also never had, Listen, man, I mean, you kind of know me. I don't really go by convention, you know, and I try not to, I don't go by the rules of comedy. I don't believe there are any set rules in how you structure a set or how you build or how you, I do agree that sometimes you have to be responsible and play it safe. But I had a monster opening 25 minutes. And then the crowd was losing a bit of energy because it wasn't almost a 3-hour show that started at 9 p.m. on the Sunday. Right. So by that point, we're pushing 9:40. The energy's kind of slowing down a little bit. So I was like, all right, nobody's going to be mad if I do 30 instead of 35. Right. Let me close on this joke that I've never done in this room before. That is really just like a month old, but has worked well so far. And that has like a Harriet Tubman porn reference, you know? And it really didn't go over well, man. It really did not go over well. I've rarely ever been part of a set that where just the switch just flipped. Like I lost the audience and there was no getting them back. Like I hit eject on the joke. I tried to do another joke. They just weren't having it. And I kind of was like, you win some, you lose some. You know, this can't go on forever. I'm good. I'm out. And Kenny never said anything. And I apologized to him. I'm like, listen, man, this is what I did. And he's like, dude, you do what you need to do to grow. And so I appreciated that because, again, if there hasn't been a set to this day, I do regret it, man. If I had to do it over, I would have closed on something safer. I would have maybe couched that in the middle, you know. But I can honestly say that there is no set that I've learned from or grown from as much as that one set. I watched that tape at least 60 times and looked at everything from how I was moving on stage to, because Kenny told me, he's like, the stage at Yucks is deep. And he's like, Kenny told me, he's like, dude, you're at the end of the stage. You're kind of laid back. You're slouching. And so I started to look at all of that. I took the hat, I was wearing a hat and a hoodie. And I'm like, I look like I'm 16. And meanwhile, I'm talking about things that are fairly sensitive on the racial side, on the social side, on the political side. And I realized it kind of clicked in that moment. I'm like, if I didn't really look 16, but I did look 21, 22. And I'm like, if I look like I'm 22, 23 talking about this, it comes across as a little bit of juvenile angst and rebellion. But I'm like, if I wore a collared shirt and people are like, this dude is 30, it comes across without changing the content, by changing the messenger or how the messenger looks, especially in a situation where you're on a show and there's 8 comics and everybody's got 7 to 10 minutes. Like, audiences don't really have time if they're going to see a dude. I mean, you could see it in my headshot, which was taken around that time. My hat is like 90 degrees up from my head. Right? Like I didn't even have, like, I had the hat going up like that. So people make judgments, and I realized that might actually affect how the material comes across. And to be honest, it did, because all I had to do, I wasn't wearing formal wear, but all I had to do was take out the hat, stop wearing sweatpants, come on with like actual pants, you know. I never wore shorts on stage, though. That's where I draw the line.
That's why they didn't, you know, get you up for the death squads. It's also, yeah. Are you gonna quote Kenny? Kenny has a big quote about how it's dressed. It's all about thumbnails. Dressing. One of the ways you dress is just one of the ways to thumbnail who you are to the audience.
Yeah.
But what's you gonna quote Kenny's big line?
No, I what was Kenny's? Which line am I gonna quote?
I was telling people a certain thing, and then I found out Kenny was saying basically the same thing. We just coached it slightly differently.
Oh, I didn't know that. What is the line?
I always told people, dress like you would dress on a first date. And then Kenny's thing was to dress like you want to get laid.
I was going to say, like, you're about to fuck, you know? Like, yeah. But get laid. We had the same idea, just couch differently. I am also actively trying to curse less on stage as well. I'm never gonna be like a clean comic in the sense that, you know, whatever, no cursing, but I am much more conscious. I am much more conscious and cautious of it.
It has greater impact if you use it rarer.
It definitely does. And ultimately, you have to be open to the fact that even if something doesn't bother you, it may bother other people. And so I'm not saying compromise for that, but just a certain awarenessness and sensitivity to it, you know, to that extent. But
you know me to be, you know me, you wouldn't really consider me a clean comic, but I also am somebody who doesn't swear.
Right.
Right. Or I try not to swear on stage, but that was.
Yeah, but man, I mean, like, dude, Kenny, man, I'll say this, and I've said this to him. You know, I would not be where I'm at in comedy without Kenny literally putting his arm around me. Listen, man, the first time I finished Nubian, I had a monster set. I don't think I've ever had a set that strong as I did my first time on the show, and I don't know what it was, right? But Kenny sat me down afterwards, and he's like, "Listen, your family. Your crew now." And I'm like, all right, cool, man. Thank you. And I think he sensed that I took it kind of flippantly. And so he just put his hand on my shoulder and he's like, "No, your crew, you heard me?" And I'm like, all right, man, I got you, you know? But honestly, man, I felt it. I felt it afterwards with the advice, with the love, with the support, and in a way that never privileged his own way of doing it. So that one time where he was like, "Yo, you got to learn to perform," he didn't tell me what to do. I asked him, I was like, "What do you want?" Like, "You want me to raise my voice? Should I lean in?" He's like, "You figure it out." And I had to think on it for a while, man. And for a little bit, I had a thing, you know me on stage, I'm very slow, I'm very laid back, and I still am. I did have one set at the Comedy Nest where there was a little bit of an altercation, with like one of the patrons, and I had to get pulled off and I had to go on stage 30 seconds later. So because of the adrenaline, I was very animated and very loud. And I kind of carried that energy on stage for a few months, but it never felt natural. It wasn't me. So when Kenny came with that performative comment, I was like, dude, I'm just not that guy, man. But then I started thinking about it, and there are other ways, man. So there's a comic that I love and have learned a lot from watching here called Patrick Hay. Yeah. And Patrick is a very tall, like slender, kind of same physique as me, very laid back as well. Sometimes we'll do an entire 20, 25 minutes, half an hour on a stool and not get up. And very, very slow, lulls you in. But Patrick performs with his face. Patrick will give you a smile, and he has that Magic Johnson ear-to-ear smile. Patrick will give you a look with his eyes, right? Where you're fixated. So I started to think about it in these terms. I need to give you a reason to watch. It's not enough to just listen. I need to give you a reason to watch as well. Right. So
thumbnails to the emotional content.
Yeah, there's got to be a difference between listening to it in audio and watching the performance. Otherwise, and I started to notice, I was like, oh, when I used to listen to comedy albums when I was younger, you'd always feel left out because there was always a moment where the audience laughed, but you never really knew why. And you're like, something must have happened. Right. And so I try to keep that in mind. I also little things, man, like I am much more confident on stage. I can handle a lot of situations better. And that helps with focusing when you're not trying to remember your jokes, or when you know that you have more material than the amount of time. Because when you start doing comedy, you have 5 minutes, but you're given 5 minutes, but you don't really have 5 minutes. So everything you're doing is stretching time. And then at some point you're given 10 to 15, but you may not have 10 to 15. At some point you're given 20, but you only have 20. So if a joke or two doesn't work, or if they're not into like a topic, you're in hot water.
Or if you jump a line.
Yeah. And then you're at a point where you're like, yeah, I could do an hour, but I'm only asked to do 20. So there's way less pressure on me to remember exactly what jokes I'm going to do. I got other jokes if I forget.
I just want to refer to Tim Riel's comment. He just said swearing isn't a good hill to die on. And if you think that's where your art is, you have a bigger issue.
I agree.
Definitely.
I agree. But I think to an extent, you can make an argument that it's policing language. I do think you need the versatility to address different audiences. At the end of the day, we're speakers. And at least the way I approach comedy. And I know you mentioned you wanted to talk about like writing, like the approach to writing. And I think that the biggest change in my approach to comedy, somebody told me this when I first started comedy, and I've really apologized that I can't remember who it is. It was a Montreal comic. But somebody told me, he was like, generally the stages of progression for a comic is, this is how I look, right? Like those are your jokes early on, this is who I am. You start kind of telling like a little bit of who you are, whatever. And then the third stage is, this is how I think, or this is what I think, right? And so I never kind of opened with the this is how I look. I don't have like too many this is how I look jokes, but I did kind of for a while was in this is who I am. And over time, ironically, in coming to Toronto, so when I started comedy, I didn't want to talk about culture and race, because I'm like, I don't want to be pigeonholed, and it's what everybody expects me to talk about. So whatever, I'm not doing that. But I would keep getting these questions like, yo, you say you're Middle Eastern, but you talk how you talk and you dress how you dress. How? Or you say you're a doctor, are you really? So I figured if people were thinking
sound like
about
Michigan.
I don't know, man. I've lived in the Midwest. I've been to British schools. I learned English from hip hop and television. So like it's a mongrel accent of a lot of different things,
But your rhythm to speaking, that's one of the things that helped you stand out when you started.
I appreciate that.
And a lot of people, because there's a lot of comics who either go up trying to be chirpy or trying to bark, and you just kind of,
That's an intro. I appreciate that. I'll get back to that, because that ties back into the Ph.D. really, and and what the Ph.D. taught me, which transferred into comedy, which was perfect for comedy, and I think helped me get through super quick. But that transition in approach to writing, I did go who I was, and then I started talking about culture and immigration, and I started opening with that because I'm like, I want to get that out the way. I want people not. And then when I came to Toronto, I had a couple of comics that's like, dude, you don't have to, or why are you opening? Why are you boxing yourself into that? This is who I am. And Daryl Lennox, man, I have a joke about how I got into comedy. And it was the first joke I wrote, but since the version now has not a single line from the first version, right? It's a 3-minute bit that has literally not one line from what it was when I first wrote it. I just took the idea, took what I learned from comedy, and was able to flip everything on it. It's a completely new joke. But I was hosting for Daryl Lennox, and I did that joke, right? And it's a joke about heartbreak, really. It's really a joke about heartbreak. And then I brought the next comic on. And as soon as I got back, he called me over, and I sat next to him, and he was like, that's the joke. And I didn't totally get what he meant. And he's like, listen, I'll talk to you after the show. And I sat with him for a good hour after the show. And he was like, that joke is raw. It's vulnerable. It's universal, and it tells me a lot about the type of person that you are. And he's like, I'm not telling you how to do comedy. I'm not telling you how to structure your material, but I would like to see you at least try to open with that joke. And that feeling that I had because you made me tap into my own past heartbreak. And in that moment, I felt connected to you. And in that connection, he's like, I want you to try to stay in that moment for as long as you can. Try to extend that with whatever you got. And he's like, if you can establish that up top for however long it is, it might be 3, 5, 10 minutes. He's like, you can get away with anything after that. He's like, you can do anything you want. And he brought up a special that I hadn't, at the time, I hadn't watched it as a special, but I watched it at Just for Laughs before it was recorded as a Netflix special. And it was Hassan Minaj's special. And that was very, to me, I was like 6 months into comedy that summer. And I kind of was toying around with the idea of talking about autobiographical experiences, but didn't really want to. And so that hour and change was very, very influential on me. But he brought that up and he was like, what's the Hassan Minaj special about? And I was like, it's about family and immigration, man, and identity. And he was like, no. He's like, it's about love. It's about heartbreak. He's like, he couched that story in that, and it made all of those ideas more palatable. But he was like, it was something universal. He's like, he said, if you want to be the Arab comic, you could be the Arab comic. But you have what it takes to be bigger than that, and just like a comic that talks about things. So that was very important. And that came at a time where I had almost had enough about talking about myself. Like, as it I'm like, there's only, all right, however funny I make this, however interesting it is, it's still just an experience. It's my experience. I can't make any and at that time, I noticed a shift in my writing where I have a hard time. I'm not a creative person, man. There's nothing I have said or shared on stage that is not actually a true event or a lived experience. I just don't have the ability to just invent things. And I don't know. I have a unique perspective on things, but I don't have the type of quirky mind, right, that can just say something that's funny, like unequivocally without context. I recognize that about myself. But I got to a point, so the way I used to write was, if something funny happened, I would then apply my comedy knowledge to write it into a bit, or combine two things. Or if I was telling a story in the flow of natural conversation and somebody laughed, I'm like, I could probably tell that on stage, or try to, or fashion it for stage. So that's how I approached like developing material. And I was always diligent. I had to have the pad and pen with me at all times, because any idea, I'm also very meticulous with words. So sometimes it's a funny way of saying something versus like sometimes the wording is key. Sometimes the wording is key. But then I realized, and this is where I've been at for a year, so my writing took a hit. I think that the quality of the jokes I've been writing the last year has taken a hit, but that's because I write backwards now. I always wrote backwards in terms of, this is the punchline and how do I get to this punchline? But now I write, now the question I ask myself is, what am I trying to say? What is the point of this joke? What's really funny? Because I noticed I would tell jokes, and then when I would explain the joke off stage to a friend, or would be talking about the writing process, they'd be like, yo, that's the key idea right there. And I'm like, oh, I should probably say that one line, even though it's not funny, but it puts the joke into like a proper context, and you understand what the idea is. And I'm like, oh, this is how I can start to convey ideas by using jokes. So now I'm like, what's the idea that I want to convey? And then I go backwards in terms of, how do I write a joke around that? What's going to be the best story, or how to best build the argument, And with the amount of stage time that I've been very fortunate to get in Toronto, I'm at a point where I can use the stage to write, and that's very helpful in terms of, I'll jot a few ideas down, but I can't. So I've gone on stage and talked to audiences and been like, yo, I have this idea. I don't know what's funny about it, but I feel like there's something there. And I can just talk about like my idea or my thinking process. And if they don't laugh, I know I was wrong, right? But if they're at least interested and laugh at one or two points, then I know I have something, and that's my silly putty, and then I can go back and work with it, right?
Right.
Yeah. So I know you mentioned something. I don't want to go on too long, man. I feel like I've been talking like very uninterrupted, but you were talking about like the slow pace.
Well,
And
you're well. One of the things, like I did a couple, produced a couple open mics, and one of the things is I'd never wanted it to be the same sounding comic over and over again. And you were very unique when you came out with.
I appreciate that.
Your pacing. You had almost a musical style. You laid back. You had a slower rhythm.
That's what I was going to say. Listen, man, I mean, I love Chris Rock is one of my top comics, so very animated. Bill Burr is one of my top comics, so very animated. Thank you. I appreciate you, man. But Mitch Hedberg was a big comedy influence on me. And Mitch Hedberg is very slow, and clearly nothing beyond like the writing style is not influenced by Mitch in any kind of way. But there's a respect for that. And to me, it is music, man. And a big influence, two of the biggest influences, maybe three of the biggest influences on how I approach comedy are hip hop artists. Our hip hop artists. And the first one is Rakim. And Rakim has incredible voice control, and it's very methodical. There's no excess fat. There are no excess words, right? It's very clean and clear. You can hear and understand every word he is saying. And so that was a big influence. The second is a rapper from Houston, one of the all-time greats in my book, called Scarface. And he uses vocal inflections a lot. So he'll talk like this a little bit and then go up and then go back down, which is a very kind of like preacher, it is a very kind of preacher approach to things. But that taught me that you can use your voice to emphasize like certain parts of what you're saying without yelling. Right. And then the other person is a producer called JD. Jay Dilla, who produced for A Tribe Called Quest, who produced for Janet Jackson, who produced for The Roots, right? And he would take out, so hip hop is very rhythmic, right? So boom, 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 on a very basic drum pattern, with snares. And he would do things like take a snare out. So you would have silence at a moment where you were expecting something. Right. Or move the metronome. So like if the cymbal was going, he'd move one and it'd be off beat. And that little motion would create an extra moment of silence. And I learned that the use of silence to punctuate rhythm, right? I learned that from music and just applied it to comedy. And I learned it even more. I learned to pronounce it even more. I was doing a set at the Nest, man, and I can't remember exactly when, but for 6 months into comedy. And I go out, and my first joke, I'm like, let's go punch him in the mouth with a quick one. This one hits all the time.
Make him laugh in 10 seconds.
And I did it, and dead silence. And I panicked. And when you're on stage, that panic seems long, but it's a split second. Yeah. It's a split second. And as I was processing, I'm like, yo, what do I do next? Somebody laughed. And then 2-3 people laughed. And then literally within another moment, the whole room had laughed. And I'm like, yo, don't rush, man. Like, people are processing what you're saying. And the less information you use or the less words that you use to convey the information that you're trying to get across. So comedy to me is like a puzzle. It's like a puzzle because it's like, how am I going to order this information to have the biggest impact of laughter? Because sometimes you have to make a reveal. And then the second part is in the least amount of words, right? Yeah. So first it's the structuring of the information, and then it's the brevity. And because a lot of times, like, I struggled with a joke where I have a joke about meeting a white Tyrone, right? And it's a 3-minute joke about white Tyrone. And really, I found out later, I didn't know this at the time, right? But the Tyrone's originally an Irish name. And there's
you actually added that into the joke because I remember
I did, but that comes later in the joke.
Yeah.
Right. That comes later in the joke. So the problem with that joke is sometimes at some shows, there are Irish people in the crowd who will yell out as soon as I say that, who will yell out like, Tyrone's an Irish name. And I'm like, fuck. So I tried to crack the code. I talked about it with a comic and he was like, yo, open with that and then go into the joke and see if it works. Essentially what you're doing though is you're showing them the rabbit, but you're putting it back in the hat, and then you're pulling it out again though. And so it does work. The joke still stands, but it doesn't have the same impact. And so the way you structure things is gonna, is gonna influence the impact. But
do you remember my story about the assaulting a police officer charge?
Remind me.
It's kind of a long story, but when I worked at a hotel, and I got charged with assaulting a police officer. So I go in, I say that at the front, and then I tell the story about everything coming up. And then when it gets to the point that the person I had a scuffle with ends up being revealed to have been a police officer, it's a surprise again.
Right. So how long of a distance do you create?
It's a long
dunk. So but all of those are considerations.
6 minutes. Yeah. So, but it's got the punches all the way through. But.
Yeah, mine is still at 3 minutes, and that's not enough space. There's also the ability that sometimes I can fast forward through parts, so sometimes I do that joke in a minute. But my friend did say something interesting. He's like, do you always tell them that you know? And why is it important for you to let them know that you know? Right? Because I'm like, I accordion, because he asked me something. And I had also, I never took a comedy class, man. I decided to do comedy and started doing stand-up a week later and then just did it, and that was that. So he was asking me, he's like, is it a joke or is it a bit? And I'm like, I don't know what the fuck. I don't know what you're talking. Like, I've heard those terms, man, but I don't care. I don't know.
Bits, chunks, yeah.
Exactly. And so we broke it down and he's like, it's a bit, it's multiple jokes, and so then you just kind of move them around and play around with blah, blah, blah. But we did get to the point where I always end that joke by letting the crowd know that I know, for whatever that's worth. But a lot of my joke writing is Ph.D. writing, man, because with the Ph.D., I had to learn to do two things, essentially. Structure an argument in the most logical way. How are you going to get your point heard or get that idea across? And the other thing in writing that I focused on with the Ph.D., somebody told me this, like in my master's, one of my professors, we were talking about brevity in writing. Because I was like, dude, I have this great idea for a paper. I was always that kind of student where I never wrote a paper along the guidelines that we were given. I always went to the professor and was like, cool, I'll do it this way, but I got this great idea. Can I do it that way? And honestly, more often than not, professors were like, go ahead. And so I had this one prof. I was like, yo, this is what I want to do, but I can't write 30 pages, man. I'm going to write 15. And he's like, it doesn't matter how long it is. He's like, shorter writer is better writing. Shorter writing is better writing, and there's this idea, this quote that's attributed to Mark Twain, but that's also attributed to Pascal, a French philosopher. And it's a common idea that exists amongst writers that doesn't really have like an origin, but it's in a letter and it's in a correspondence. And the writer signs off with, I'm sorry I couldn't write you a short letter. I just didn't have the time. Right? Because there's more of an intentionality. There's more of an intentionality to concise writing. And then I started paying attention to verbosity. So when I defended my PhD thesis, when I was doing the comprehensive exam, so the first step before that, I told my committee, I'm like, listen, my dissertation is going to be 175 pages. And they were like, that's too short. And I told them, I was like, don't worry about length. I'm a graduate student. There's nothing I have to say that I can't say in 175 pages. I'll make sure all the markers are there. I'll make sure all the content and the requirements and the criteria are met. And then I picked a supervisor who was an English lit major, like who had an English lit background. She was an education professor, but she had an English lit background. And I asked her, I was like, I need you to be brutal with my writing. And I considered myself and really was a good writer at the time. I wasn't. I became a good writer. But she started telling me, she's like, yo, in my opinion, has no room in writing. You just wasted 3 words.
Yeah.
You're writing it. It is in your opinion. Own an idea. I believe that. No, just say what it is. I believe that the sky is blue, or just say that the sky is blue. You know, so in a lot of writing, it's normal that you would say, in my opinion, comedy is an art form. Right? In my opinion, I believe that comedy is an art form. And really what you just did is comedy is an art form. Those are really the only words that count. You just put like literally 60% of fat in that sentence. And so that ruthlessness in editing, I clocked in at 225. I could have handed it in. And I spent 2 months bringing it down to 175. Because I'm like, this sentence is dope, but it's a repeated idea. They get the point. So all of that translated to comedy. I had to write 550 pages to keep 175. So the idea of letting go of a shitty 2 minutes was really not a problem. I understood the volume of what it takes to write in terms of what you throw out versus what you keep. I understood that from 4 years of a doctoral program, where you're talking hours and hours and hours of writing that you then look at and be like, this doesn't fit.
Let's inform everyone, what is your doctorate in?
I have a Ph.D. in education, and I wrote my dissertation on a TV show called The Wire. And so essentially, again, I used the show as almost as a springboard to ideas that I had already in my head and that I had read on, but that were also kind of depicted in the show. And really, I was looking at the functions of the social functions of schools as like organizations that socialize and manage large groups of people. And then I looked at the similarities because I'd worked in substance abuse. I'd worked in psychology. I've worked with inmates as well. I've worked in education. I started to see similarities in the language, in some of the practices. And so I was just fascinated with a lot of the overlap that existed between those different enterprises and how those different industries almost work in concert with one another. Right?
And The Wire does the dive into the education system.
It does. So I used season 4 because that's a season that's focused on education. But I wanted to talk about statistics and the way that people use statistics in misleading ways. I wanted to talk about informal modes of education, and I really didn't want to truncate the show into one season. So I ended up doing season 1, 3, 4, and a bit of season 5. Like I almost just took the whole show. It's not a show that I feel you can. Part of the greatness of the show. Season. You know what? I like the. I didn't enjoy the second season when I watched it, but at the end of the show, once I got to season 5, I understood the importance of the second season in the narrative. And when I watched the show again, I found the second season to be one of the more enjoyable seasons. It just didn't have a space. The unions and the port and everything didn't have a space in what I was talking about. Whereas things like statistics, which is what they were doing with the crime, is what's applied to like educational practice, or some of the ways in which D'Angelo was talking to to Wallace and to Brody in the pit. That's informal education. Yeah. Right? So exactly, like that chess scene is a scene that I used as a method of because my point was one of the guiding kind of ideas is that schooling and education are very different. Yeah. Right? Like we conflate the two and we use the terms interchangeably. But education is an act of learning. It's an act of an acquisition of knowledge, and most of our learning and most of our knowledge is acquired outside of school. We go to school to learn, and the idea is it's a place of learning, but it's predominantly a place of socialization, right? It's a place of schooling before it is a place. And we need it, man, like to an extent. I think it goes way overboard, but I'm not the type of person that's like social anarchy, everybody create your own language, right? Like I'm not that dude.
I believe, like, I love that some society, some sections of society have those benchmarks that you go into. When you get a certain age, you're expected to act a certain way, etc. I don't think people should be forced into boxes, but I at the same time, I think people should have a point where they're graduated into responsibility from what they have learned. And I feel we've lost that a lot. By the way, if anyone has any questions about The Wire, maybe you want to drop them in.
Please,
I noticed that we got a bunch of, or any questions for Habib, just drop them in. I always thought, I sort of joked that your doctorate was actually in sneakerology.
Yeah. There is that. I've had a hard time. So for people who don't know, I have an obscene sneaker collection. I've got into debt over, there was a joke, the joke that Paul likes is like, I got sneaker debt. I owe the bank a lot of money. I have more sneaker debt than I have like education debt, to be perfectly honest. And I got like 3 degrees. But that's an experience, and that's a part of my consumerism that I've had a hard time, or part of my personality that I've had a hard time translating on stage. Like I've tried to talk about it. I don't think people understand the depths of my addiction. I don't think people understand that, like, I own an obscene, like I could legitimately, this is not even like a matter of speech or an exaggeration. I don't need to buy another pair of shoes for the rest of my life. And I did the math. I could probably only wear each pair 12 times between now and the time that I died if I lived to see 85. Right? Like I got 12 wears. I got 12 wears a pair. That's it. And it did. Sorry to cut you off. It did work. It did work at Sasha Manoli used to run a show. I can't remember the name of it, but used to have visual. They used to have visual aids. So I got to tell some of my sneaker stuff using visual aids, and it worked. But in a strict stand-up setting, it's very difficult. And so what I ended up doing to marry kind of those two passions and to do it in a setting that would help like people understand. And it worked a lot better in that setting. I produced 2 shows. It was meant to be a series of 3, but it ended up the 3rd one. They were just too expensive to produce, man, honestly. Like at Sellout, we sold out the first one and we didn't make any money. So it was almost a vanity project, but it was something that I wanted for my comedy portfolio and as an experience. I learned more in terms of like, I lost a few $100 on the project, but I learned way more. I gained way more in knowledge, right? And so my friend had a venue, and I ended up doing a sneaker exhibit and a comedy show.
Yeah.
And so during the show, the exhibit was only opened after the show, right? Like, so the exhibit was in a separate space and it was made open to the public or the audience after the show. But during the show, we were performing. We built a stage, like we literally built a stage. And then behind the stage, we built racks. And so there was 140 sneakers on display behind the stage while you were performing comedy.
Like the backdrop was 140.
Yes, was 100 and with a red curtain behind it.
Yeah.
So it looked like a show, but it had that. And then so I did things like that where I was able to marry those two passions, man. But it's something that I do want to revisit. You're
a Yucks comic.
I am.
Right. You're signed Yucks comic. Now, there is Terry Clement.
I love Terry. Terry's a sweetheart. He
utilizes because a lot of the Yucks clubs have the big monitors, and he utilizes them to in event. So you could add that visual element to Yucks shows. And you've done Fringe. You've got Fringe experience. You could possibly mount it as a Fringe show.
Those are all things. Those are all very 140 sneakers on stage, yes, you know, and that is not even like a fraction of what I own, man. That's what I'm saying. It's ridiculous. I'm pretty sure.
How did you move 32 times in 2 months or whatever? What was the?
They were in storage. I put them in storage, right? I put them in storage because I was leaving the country and I figured I'll come back and worry about them later, you know? And so when I was moving, I literally had a suitcase and a box. Like my move was a cab ride, right? Because I was renting Airbnbs or going furnished subleases like a month, 2 months, sometimes Airbnbs to bridge the gap, and sometimes like friends' couches for like a couple of weeks if I can find anything. You know, that's something I've thought of. But listen, man, I don't knock anybody's artistic hustle. And, you know, I know what I want to do. And for right or wrong, I'm a purist. I'm a purist, man. I don't believe in the visual aid.
Okay.
If you're gonna listen, you want to call it
Terry Clement.
You want to call it a show. You want to call it a show. I think it's performance. I think it can be funny, but for the stand-up that I want to do, I want to be up there with a microphone and a stool. I'm not saying that at one point I may not use visual aids, but I wouldn't. For me, it's for right now. I'm focused on that because
microphone and stool.
That's what it is, and that was the beauty of Fringe. Is I had to tell audiences. They're theater audiences. Fringe was a very different experience because you have their attention. They're not allowed to leave the room. There's no, not for nothing, man. I didn't know about any of these things. I didn't know about the check spot in a set. You know? Yeah. I didn't know about the check spot in a set, right? I didn't know. And for those that don't know, like the check spot is that moment when you're headlining a club and 15 minutes before the end of your set, when you're just about to go into like the stretch run, it's the fourth quarter when you're locking in and you're just about to go, they give out the checks. And so essentially you're performing with 3 or 4 wait staff having their back to you, having conversations with people reading it and trying to figure out who owes what, you know? And on top of that, you got the sound of the machines going beep, 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 you know? And you got to power through that. You don't have that in Fringe. So it's a different setting. It's almost like cheating. It's almost like cheating in that regard because they can't leave the room. Once they're in there, that's it. And they're theater audiences. So they're listening to you. You have their undivided attention. It's easier in that regard. But also, it's harder to maintain that attention because they're used to a theatrical performance. These dudes are used to costumes. Right?
Yeah.
These dudes are used to projections. These dudes are used to multiple, you know, and they're not used to being spoken to, and they're not used to like being overtly like emotional or demonstrative in their reactions, I should say. And so the second Fringe run I did, by happenstance, the second Fringe run I did started off as the same. It was with John Paul, and we split it 40-40. And he did the first 2 shows and wasn't able to do the rest of the run. And I had a consideration to make. I was like, there's enough comics that I know that I could give stage time to as a thank you for showing me that kind of support. And I thought about doing that. I'm like, I can give somebody 40 every different night, you know, and then just work with somebody. Mm-hmm. Or I can be selfish and see what I can do on stage given 80 minutes.
80 minutes.
And I did 80-minute sets 10 nights in a row.
Yeah, I did 80 minutes. It's in the row. In the row is the definite learning point.
And I would hop on a bike, and like people assume, man, people just assume they were like, oh, you went like I had a lot of people that were very congratulatory and were like, oh man, that's dope. I'm lucky. Oh, you know, it's so crazy. You get to do what you do. You're really lucky and you're really fortunate. Or some people be like, oh, you're a natural. I get mad at you're a natural because people don't see that, man. I could have done that 80. and I could have went home because I work full time, man. Like, or I did, you know. So I could have done that 80, and I had to be up 9 to 5 the next day. I could have done that 80 and went home. I would take a bike ride and go wait for 45 minutes for an extra 7.
Mm-hmm.
For an extra 7, like and my friends would be like, what's the point? And I'm like, I don't know, man. It just feels like what I should be doing. And I have the energy right now. I'm older, man. I mean, I'm past 40. I turned 40 already. So I don't know how long I'm going to have that energy. No, it's true, man. No, listen, I get it. But like, and they'll say comedy's a young man's game, and I don't necessarily agree with that, because you need experience, you need to have ideas, you need to refine who you are as a person before. But yo, being on the road is not kind to the body, man. Like eating poorly, sleeping on bad mattresses, sleeping on your friends' couches and floors if whoever you're performing with on the road isn't going to put you up. Like I feel that the next day. Right? Like that hurts my back. That's no joke, you know?
I was 45, I think, when we met.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, you know, so there's a lot of that, man. But I did 16 hours of stage time in 12 days during that Fringe run.
Yeah. And
that is still the most proud I have ever been of anything that I've accomplished in comedy. You know, like, I don't give a fuck what you say about 80 minutes on stage, right? I don't care what you say. I don't care if you say I stretched material, which I did at times. None of the sets. I'm proud of 2 things. I'm proud of the fact that nobody ever walked out. And if you're bored, you're going to walk out, man. Mm-hmm. If you're bored, that money's lost. Like everyone stayed the full 80 minutes. I didn't do a full 80 every night, but the shortest I went was 72. So I was 72 to 80 minutes every night for 10 nights straight, and nobody walked out. That's 1. 2, I never did the same set twice. The jokes, even the material, was never in the same order, right? And so I went in there being like, figure it out. That was my challenge to myself. I went in there and I was like, figure it out. And I'm not going to sit here and look you in the eye through the camera and be like, I have 80 minutes. I can hold 80 minutes. Because mind you, I headlined Yucks. I headlined downtown Yucks, Toronto. And these are the things where comics start to delude themselves. And I try to stay as self-aware and as grounded as I could. Because that was that run where I was doing those 80s, that prepared me for, I was headlining Yucks Toronto 2 weeks after that run. Mm-hmm. And so I was doing 45 a night, Wednesday through Saturday, with 2 shows. I didn't get a 2-show night because it was the summer. So it was just 45 a night. Right. But so, those 80s were in a small room on a low stage to 12 to 25 people, depending on the night.
Right.
This 45 was to, depending on the night, 150 to 300. That's a very different animal. So I did 80 minutes, 10 nights straight. And I ran out of steam my first night on stage doing 45 in a club. Because I didn't get tired in terms of I ran out of jokes, but at the 30-minute mark, I'm like, I'm physically exhausted. Because when you're in that room, literally the entire audience is within arm reach. Now I got a 360 stage that literally is like 25 feet wide and 10 feet deep, and I got to use that whole stage, and I'm walking from corner to corner. So those were invaluable learning experiences, man. Yucks gets a very bad rep and a lot of people, and I can only speak on my personal experience, but the type of stage time, the quality of stage time that I've been able to get, I don't think I'd have the comedic growth, because it's in chunks, man. If I hit the road, I'm either middling or headlining at this point, right? And Yo, if I go to Niagara, that's 5 shows. If I'm headlining, that's 45 minutes. I'm doing 4 hours in 3 nights.
Yep.
That's a lot of growth. 2 years ago, the most I was getting was 10-minute sets, 12-minute sets. So to do 5 hours might have been like, realistically, like a month. Right? Because I was averaging an hour and a half. I look at stage time in time now, not in sets. So I try to get an hour and a half a week.
All right, here's the thing. Actually, this is we've been over an hour, an hour 10 at this point. How have you been dealing with the lack of stage time during lockdown? And Toronto is not hitting phase 3 like a lot of the rest of Ontario.
No, the nest is open. Like right now, the only thing we have going on are a few outdoor shows, you know, and I don't know with what with what consistency we're going to be able to maintain this. Like I genuinely don't know. I will say this, like initially the idea that a lot of people had, myself included, man, because I think every writer, and I do consider comics writers, right? Or that's a part of whether we're writers or not, we have to write, you know, like that's the, and I think every writer fantasizes about these ideal conditions where I don't have to go to work, where I don't have to, I don't have to worry about anything. And I have this time on my hand to write. And I think 2 things. The one thing I learned about with the Ph.D., because I read a quote about writing a while back, which was, a writer who waits for the perfect conditions to write will die without ever having written a word. You know, so there are no perfect conditions. And I did struggle with that at first because I'm like, yo, I'm not able to write. And I'm like, this should be the time where I'm writing. And you hear all these comics talking about, I'm going to take the time to write. But yo, we deal with a lot, man. There's a lot of uncertainty. You know, there's a lot of like, we don't know what life is going to look like. And so I understand the inability to be able to, the inability to write. So I took it easier on myself. I have a propensity to like self-flagellate and like blame, you know, and be hard on myself. And I didn't, you know.
We're both raised Catholic, right?
Yeah, we are. That's basically what it,
both of us were supposed to be priests as well.
Yes, as well. Yeah, I didn't know that about you, man. I didn't know that about you. So I honestly have not been able to write any new material. I have, again, going back to this idea of ideas, I jot down ideas. And a few funny, like a lot of how I approach joke writing is how I used to approach teaching as well. Because I used to teach university and I would have 3-hour lectures. And so in a 3-hour lecture, you're not going to remember everything. Like you're going to have a plan that you want to follow and guidelines. But I used to always highlight 3 ideas. I'm like, there are 3 ideas I want to touch on. And I would write each one out in a sentence. And I'm like, this is how I want to word it. Right? And so I have that sentence that I can then build around. And so that's what I've been doing. That's what I've been doing with some of the, with my approach to just stay tethered to it. I will say that it's been very beneficial in 2 aspects that I've been struggling with a little bit. And one of them is revisiting old material. And I think that I've rewritten a lot of jokes in terms of added new tags, improved, considerable reworking. I'm not talking about cosmetic, a word here or a word there. Like I'm talking about adding a minute to a 2-minute joke. Or reworking the first 30 seconds entirely, like it's a new entry point into the joke, because I feel like there's a lot of jokes. I mean, this idea that nothing's ever done, we just abandon it. I do kind of believe in that. You just run out of ways to, and when you're working every night, you just don't have enough distance from it. And so having not done those jokes for 3 months now, for 4 months, however long it is, I noticed about 6 weeks ago, I'm like, yo, that joke, why did I never da 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 da, you know? And I'm like, oh, I got a new angle. Here you go.
From
You know,
your description of your writing, I got to feel that you do a lot of it with a keyboard, or are you pen and
so
paper, or
I
because there's a third option that I'm not sure if you're using, which is talking it out to a recorder so you could go back and listen.
I do neither of those options. I've developed a very bad habit in writing that I'm trying to snap out of.
Okay.
I've developed a very bad habit in writing that I'm absolutely trying to snap out of. And so my first 6 months in comedy, I had a notebook and I would write out my set, handwritten. Everything was done by hand, no computers at that time in terms of the writing. But I would type out the set handwritten word for word, even if I had the jokes elsewhere. And you know me, man. Again, I don't do the same set. I try to write as much as possible and not do the same set like over and over. So in my first month in comedy, I never did the same set twice. I had new jokes my second time on stage. They weren't good jokes. I'm not even like, whatever. Like, I'm aware of that. I'm not trying to say I would say by the end of my first year, I may have had 7 minutes by the end of my first year, but I will say that I at least performed a different hour, at least 60 minutes of different material on stage. And I'm using material very loosely. Some of it was done once and I'm like, I'm never doing that ever again. But the point is, because there was this school of thought and this advice that I was given, which was do the same 5 every time out for the first 6 months. And I'm like, I don't want to do that.
Yeah,
I just that's not my.
You didn't hear that from me, but
no, I didn't. Yeah, no, I didn't. You know, and it's just a different approach, man. So ultimately, I used to jot everything down, and the repetition would help me learn the jokes, and it was all writing. And for the first year, I stopped doing that after a while because I'm like, I know the joke right now, you know. So it just became a bullet point thing. But my writing was all done by hand. My first 2 years, right? My first 2 years. And after that, it kind of tapered. And I got into this habit of just, towards the tail end of Montreal, I stopped. I jot down like words and thoughts, keywords and thoughts, but all of it's done on stage. And all of it's done not off the cuff on stage. I'll think it through in my head. I'm like, what are the beats of the joke? What do I want to hit on? How do I want to word it? And then I'll do it on stage. And then I'm like, I like how that sounded. I don't like how that sounded. I got to rework through this bit a little bit. And so I'll self-edit mentally.
You never record it yourself?
No.
I thought you had a digital recorder.
Dude, I have 20 minutes of material that like 20 minutes of club ready and tested material, not like 20 minutes of ideas, or like 25 minutes of refined club tested material that has never seen paper and that doesn't exist on any recorder. Or I mean, it exists in the sense that I've performed it on stage and recorded those sets. But beyond that, it does not exist anywhere. And what kind of pushed me to that point is I lost my hard drive crashed and my phone crashed. And I lost essentially all audio and video recording of 2.5 years worth of comedy. And I panicked because I'm like, I don't have another viable form. I don't have a viable backup. But I'm like, yo, this is all in my head. I wrote this and I recovered it all. I know it all. I didn't need it. I didn't need it on paper. You know, I really didn't. And now, if I'm having trouble with a joke, I will type it out and I'll cut it apart and I'll move things around. Like I've done things like that on occasion, but a lot of the writing happens in my head. I think that's bad practice. I'm telling you right now, I think it's bad practice because I'm on top of it now. There may be a point where there's mental slippage. There may be a point. I do think that recording your sets and listening to them is invaluable. And I do think that sometimes we write things out and we're too faithful to that writing. Because the not having that almost that written contract with the joke, as in this is who you are and what you look like, at least for me, makes it so that I try not to tell the jokes in the same way. There's always some variation of some kind. And in that looseness and freedom, I end up stumbling onto new tags and new ideas because I'm not attached to, I need to get to this line. That's the other thing, is I stopped expecting laughs because you're rushing, or if I don't get a laugh, I don't rush to the next. There was a point in comedy where if I didn't get a laugh, I would speed my way through to the next laugh point or the next tag. And now it's just like, the laugh didn't come, man. You know, it'll come on the next one.
I love getting a laugh with a shrug.
Yeah, you could do that. You could do that. I started to Kenny. That's another going back to the Godfather, man. Going back to Kenny. Kenny was like, you have very expressive eyes. Kenny tried to get me to shave, and he was like, listen, man, try shaving, maybe, because you have a very expressive face. You have a very, like, your look is very intense. And he's like, tell jokes with your eyes, and that's something that listen, man, I'm very proud of what I've been able to accomplish in 5 years of comedy. I don't think of it as a huge accomplishment. I'm never like rest easy. I'm very conscious of how much work goes into comedy, man, and how much I have left to go to grow. And I'm just grateful for the opportunities. I've also never taken any of it for granted. So if it comes tumbling down, and if this is the peak, man, if when we were running 902, you told me in 5 years, or at the time, like not even 5, man, if you told me in 4 years, you're going to get to take a plane to Halifax, right? Because it was the 902, for people who don't know, it was the Halifax area code, and it was a donair shop, that we were
Nova Scotia area code.
Nova Scotia. It's the whole Nova Scotia. Oh, wow, man. My fault on the ignorance. But my point is, if you had told me, like, if you had told me somebody's going to put you on a plane and pay for your plane ticket and put you up in a hotel, and you're going to get to fly to Halifax, and you're going to get to perform 45-minute sets and fly back, and pay you for that. And the week before, I was in Niagara doing the exact same thing. If you had told me that, and I would have laughed you out the room. It's what I've always wanted since I started comedy. Listen, man. The road. There's the experience, the experience of doing extended sets, and the best way I know how to do that at this point is the road, and that for me, it's a tough life, dude. I don't like it. I hate every aspect of it. But for those 45 minutes where I get to be on stage and I've bombed, dude, I don't want to make it sound like I'm killing the game. This is another thing that people don't, because people will post, you were talking about social media promotion, man. I joined social media for comedy. And so I learned social media through comedy and comedy posts, because that's all who I follow and who I friend, on Facebook. And I would see things like, yo, everybody killed at the show. Great show, last night. And I was like, yo, I was at that show, man. I know what happened. And very few comics will openly talk about bombing. And that's nothing I'm ashamed of, man. I have had my ass handed to me for like 20 and 25 minutes and half an hour at a time. And that will toughen one of the most mentally tough things I have had to do is get my ass handed to me 10 minutes. Like, I had a rocky first 10 minutes, and then I bombed for 30 minutes. I bombed for 30 minutes straight. I was able to right the ship the last 5, right? I dug out. But I dug out to the point that I was in the first 10 minutes, which was already shaky. And listen, man, call it what you want. Like, rocky audience, tough audience, Niagara, drunk, casino losses. There's a million ways to justify it. I bombed. I learned a lot from that bomb. But to step off stage And you know how jarring it is, man. Like, I don't think comics, I should say in general, like, not to single you out and somebody be like, what are you trying to say, Paul bombs all the time? But the only people who can relate to how agonizing a bomb really is are other comics. I don't think anybody understands what it's like to be up there, again, with no visual crutch, with no background band, with no backup singer if you forget the lyrics, with all eyes on you and you alone, and to eat shit and to have to power through it like I'm a professional. I'm going to do my time, you know? To be able to dig out of it at least for a little bit and not leave with that taste in my mouth. But yo, I stepped off stage and the first thought was, fuck, I have to be back up here in 2 hours and do another 45 minutes.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't know that I want to be on. Like, I'm literally shaken at the core at this point. I'm like, I'm distraught. Like, I was like, okay, I'm not talking to anybody. I went outside. I smoked a joint. I cleared my head. And I was like, you got this, man. You could fucking. But I had to, like, sit in the green room, not listen to the show. I'm like, I want to go in there. I want to go. Usually I listen to the entire show, whether I'm headlining or not. Like, I like to listen. I like to watch. I like to be present in the room for the entire show until it's my time to go on. Unless it's a show where it's like 10 comics and we're doing 5 minutes each, and it's, you know. But if it's a club,
we're going to be cut off in about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to mention that this entire channel runs off of donations. So if anyone wants to donate, there's the PayPal me is running at the bottom. But Habib, what do you see about the future? What do you think is there going to be something that's going to happen from the Black Lives Matter movement? And what about when clubs are reopening? That was one of the things I wanted to get to.
No, man, that seemed like a weird way to elbow BLM in there.
I think it's something that needs to be mentioned constantly. We need to be aware.
I will say this, man. I won't speak on Black Lives Matters for a number of reasons, and I don't care who makes any kind of inferences about what, because, you know, I am a minority. People know that I sympathize with like, you know, whatever politically. Like, there's a lot going on. I'm gonna bring this back to comedy and comedy specifically, and I'm talking a little bit fast because I'm mindful of time. What this quarantine did for me, at least as a comic. Listen, man, I hit a point once I started headlining, and this was a very important consideration I had to make. I didn't do it as a middle because I'm like 20-25 minutes. The host can clean up, you know, whatever. I started to self-censor. Because I do have a lot of material about Native genocide, about like social inequity, about, you know, about cultural identity, about imperialism, about, like, I have a line that says everybody's got a little bit of rape in them. And it's about how imperialism and colonialism work. And that has upset a lot of people. And I started self-censoring. And what this little bit of time away from comedy has done is give me perspective on what I want to do with comedy and who I want to be as a comic. And a very influential person. Like, I watched essentially a couple of Paul Mooney specials. And I'm like, yo, this dude does not hold back. This dude does not give a fuck. And I'm not saying I'm trying to be Paul Mooney. I'm not saying I am Paul Mooney. I'm not saying like it's even comparable ideas or philosophy. But that idea of, yo, as comics, yeah, dude, you could write 10 minutes about mayonnaise and it can be killer. It can be funny. I've seen comics do that. That's not what I'm into comedy for, right? So a lot of this social climate has helped almost inform and guide my comedy. I have no clue when clubs are going to be back. Comedy not started, but comedy at one point was very looked down upon and almost illegal. And the whole idea of speech and being able to say things that we say on stage, people were incarcerated for, people had to go to jail for that, man. Yeah. And so I think comedy will always find a way to thrive and survive and adapt. I see it right now with patio shows. shows, with outdoor shows, with park shows. We are speakers, man. We are speakers. And that existed way before the technology to have like speakers and auditoriums, and that kind of oral history has existed since way before the technology that we need to do stand-up comedy was invented. So I hope that when we come back, we are more socially informed and we are more politically informed and guided, you know. But that's what I want out of comedy. It's what I want out of this art form, but I also can't impose it on everyone. We have movies that'll make you think. We have movies that are just bubblegum action movies, and we have movies that are just racist and ignorant, you know, and that's just, it's a reflection. Art is a reflection of society. And so I hope that some of this social change, it helps us clean up, you know, it helps us clean up our art, man. That's, you know.
All right. This has been They Talk Funny. This has been Habib Siam. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you for having me, man.
It's my pleasure. My pleasure. Yeah. So please check out the channel. This is They Talk Funny. We've got a back catalog of 21 other videos talking with people. And we come out with a new one about once a week at this point. So thank you very much for tuning in. My name has been Paul Ash, and my special guest is Dr. Habib Siam.
Thank you. The love doctor. You're the love doctor, man. We're both doctors. Oh, shit. Fuck. You can edit that out. Oh, fuck. I didn't know nobody knew.